Welcome back to Systemic Embryology. Today's topic is very interesting, that is embryology of cardiovascular system. Under it, the first topic is development of heart. So where we are going to learn about its development and clinical aspects. So the vascular system starts its development in the middle of the third week of gestation. So it is the first system to start functioning in the embryo. So here is an embryo during the middle of the third week, that is before gastrulation we can tell, and where we can see the primitive streak on its caudal aspect, and the caudally we can see the cloacal membrane, and here is the buccopharyngeal membrane. So heart develops from progenitor heart cells. These progenitor heart cells lie in the epiblast immediately adjacent to the cranial end of the primitive streak. So here is the cranial end of the primitive streak. So just adjacent to the cranial end of the primitive streak, progenitor heart cells lie in the epiblast cells. Because the gastrulation is not yet completed, so we can't say ectoderm, endoderm, mesoderm. Here the germ disc contains epiblast and hypoblast. So the epiblast forms the progenitor heart cells. So the cells migrate from the epiblast layer through the primitive streak into the splanchnic layer of lateral plate mesoderm. So the epiblast cells, which later conforms to form the ectoderm, these cells will travel into the splanchnic layer of lateral plate mesoderm, which later turns into primordial heart, which forms the muscles of the heart. So thus the heart is mesodermal in origin. So here we can see the epiblast cells and hypoblast cells. And this is the amniotic sac, yolk sac, and here is the heart tube. So the cells of the epiblast migrate through the primitive streak to reach the primordial cardiogenic area. So this region where you are seeing the heart tube is the primordial cardiogenic area, which contain cluster of cells, which these cells are seen approximately on 16th day of gestation, and once these cells are established in the cardiogenic area, the underlying pharyngeal endoderm induces these cells to differentiate as myoblast and blood islands, and that will form the blood vessels and blood. So underneath this, it induces the myoblast to form in the heart tube, in the wall of the heart tube, and also the blood. So the heart develops from the primitive heart tube, which forms from the mesenchyme in the cardiogenic area. So this red tube, what you are seeing, is the primitive heart tube. So this primitive heart tube, which forms from the mesenchyme in the cardiogenic area of the embryo. So developed heart consists of three layers, that is the innermost endocardium, middle layer is the myocardium, and outermost layer is the epicardium. So the primitive heart tube forms the endocardium of the heart. The splanchnic mesoderm surrounding the primitive heart tube forms the myocardium and epicardium. So the heart starts functioning at the end of the third week of intrauterine life, that is on 22nd day. So the blood flow begins during the fourth week of intrauterine life. The earliest sign of appearance of heart is by two endothelial strands known as angioblast cords in the cardiogenic mesoderm, and these cords canalize to form two twin thin endothelial heart tubes. So what you are seeing are two thin walled endothelial heart tubes. In the beginning, the cardiogenic area is located anterior to the neural tube and oropharyngeal membrane. So we can see here the endothelial heart tube is on the anterior aspect. Anterior to the heart tube we have got septum transversum. So anterior to the neural tube and oropharyngeal membrane it is located. So here is the oropharyngeal membrane. The cardiogenic area, it is an area at the cranial end of the trilaminar embryonic disc between the septum transversum and procaudal plate. So here we can see anteriorly septum transversum, that is at the cranial end, and posterior or the caudal to the heart tube we can see the procaudal plate. So the part of the intraembryonic coelom lying in this area forms the pericardial cavity, and the splanchnopluric mesoderm, which is lying underneath the pericardial cavity, forms the heart tube. So this is the pericardial cavity. So here we can see the purple one is the pericardial cavity and the red one is the heart tube. So with the development of brain vesicles in the head fold, the oropharyngeal membrane moves forward and the heart tubes with the pericardial cavity lies ventral to the cervical region. So you can see the head fold, and these are the brain vesicles which are developing. Forming enlarged head fold, and because of that you can see the heart tube and pericardial cavity lies ventrally, and also the septum transversum moves caudal to the heart tube. So during lateral embryonic folding, that is the two lateral folds, these endothelial heart tubes approach each other to form a single heart tube. So we have seen that the two endothelial heart tubes, they fuse with each other, forming a single heart tube. So the cranial part of the heart tube is the arterial end. So this is the cranial side. This is fusion, so it forms the arterial end. And the caudal most unfused bifurcated part is the venous end. So this heart tube becomes a continuous expanded tube with inner endothelial lining and outer myocardial layer. So the heart begins to beat by 22 to 23 days and blood flow begins during 4th week of intrauterine life. So the myocardium differentiates to form a thick myocardium and also secretes a layer of extracellular matrix which is called as cardiac jelly, or which is rich in hyaluronic acid. So the surrounding mesenchymal cells, it differentiates to form epicardium. So therefore the heart consists of endocardium, which forms the endothelial lining, myocardium forms the muscles of the heart from the splanchnopluric mesoderm, and epicardium from the visceral pericardium and derived from the mesothelial cells of the splanchnic mesoderm, and also involves in the development of coronary arteries. So not only in the development of heart, we see the coronary arteries are also derived from the epicardium. So the heart tube elongates, exhibiting alternate dilatations and constrictions. So here we can see the alternate dilatations. And in between constrictions. So the 4 dilatations from cranial to caudal are, so you can see alternatively 4 dilatations. So the cranial most is the bulbus cordis. And below the bulbus cordis is the primitive ventricle. And below to the primitive ventricle is the primitive atrium. And caudal most part is the sinus venosus. So sinus venosus is the venous end of the heart tube. So bulbus cordis, it is further divided into, so what you are seeing is the bulbus cordis. Now we shall see the subdivisions of bulbus cordis. Bulbus cordis is further divided into truncus arteriosus, conus arteriosus and conus cordis, which forms the proximal 1/3. So the truncus arteriosus, Then next to truncus arteriosus is the conus arteriosus. And below it is the conus cordis. So truncus arteriosus forms the arterial end and it is continuous with the aortic sac cranially. So this is the aortic sac. So this aortic sac, we can see it is dividing into aortic arch arteries. So further it divides on each side as the aortic arch arteries which invade into pharyngeal arches. So that was about the arterial end. Next we shall see the venous end. So sinus venosus is the venous end containing two horns and each horn receives umbilical, vitelline and common cardinal veins. So this is right and left venous horns you can see. Sinus venosus. So each horn of sinus venosus, we can see it divides further into umbilical. It receives the tributaries of umbilical, vitelline and common cardinal. So umbilical is via the umbilical cord they reaches, and vitelline veins usually they drain the yolk sac and the gut tube, and common cardinal veins drain the body wall. So as the heart tube grows, it bends forming a cardiac loop and which invaginates into the pericardial cavity. So here we can appreciate the looping of the heart. So as the heart tube grows, we can see it is looping, it bends, forming a cardiac loop. So this is the cardiac loop. So because of the looping of the heart, the caudal sinus venosus turns posteriorly and gets absorbed into the developing heart. So the sinus venosus, it turns, so this is the sinus venosus which is the venous end of the heart, and this is the arterial end of the heart which is the truncus arteriosus. And you can see the truncus arteriosus where it continues as the aortic sac and it divides into aortic arch arteries. So these are the aortic arch arteries. So because of this looping of the heart, the caudal sinus venosus turns posteriorly and later gets absorbed into the developing heart, forming the posterior, because of this, the posterior smooth part of the atria, especially the right atrium posterior wall of the left, is formed by the absorbed part of pulmonary veins. So you can see the posterior part of the left atrium where we can appreciate the pulmonary veins. Which gets absorbed into the posterior wall of the heart, forming the posterior wall of the left ventricle. And the anterior rough part of the atria is derived from the primitive atrium. So the rough inflow part of the ventricles is derived from the primitive ventricle. So the smooth outflowing part of the ventricles is derived from the conus. So the smooth outflow is here of the ventricles, which are derived from the conus, and the rough part is here, which is derived from the primitive ventricles. So let's see the embryonic dilatation and what it forms in adults. So the truncus arteriosus forms the ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk. So the truncus arteriosus gives rise to ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk. So the bulbus cordis forms the smooth upper part of the right ventricle. that is from the conus arteriosus, forms the smooth upper part of right ventricle. So this is the right ventricle which is continuing into the pulmonary trunk. So the smooth part, this area internally, the smooth part, it is derived from the conus arteriosus. Smooth upper part of the left ventricle is from the aortic vestibule. So this is from the aortic vestibule, upper part of the left ventricle. Next, about the primitive ventricle. The primitive ventricle turns to form a trabeculated part of the right ventricle. So if you see the right ventricle, so here is the and left ventricle continues into the aorta, and because of the looping of heart, we can see the aorta, it is overridden by the pulmonary trunk. So the trabeculated part of the right ventricle and trabeculated part of the left ventricle, they both are derived from the primitive ventricle. So next, what happens to the primitive atrium? So the primitive atrium, that is the trabeculated part of the right atrium, which forms the and also the trabeculated part of the left atrium, are all derived from the primitive ventricle. So if you see the auricle of the right atrium, this part contains a trabecula inside, meshwork inside. Similarly, the left atria here, there are the meshwork inside which are derived from the primitive atrium. Then about the sinus venosus, the smooth part of the right atrium. So here is the posterior view of the heart showing the smooth part of right atrium and the left atrium. The smooth part of the right atrium means this part. The smooth part of the right atrium is derived from the sinus venosus, that is sinus venorium, and it forms the coronary sinus and also it forms the oblique vein of left atrium. Let's see the variations of dilatations of the heart tube. So the truncus arteriosus, it is partitioned to form the ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk. So you can see this whole thing is the truncus arteriosus. It divides to form, the blue one is the pulmonary trunk, and the red one is the ascending aorta. And primitive ventricle and bulbus cordis are partitioned to form right and left ventricle. So primitive ventricle is the lower part. It forms right and left ventricle. So the right and left ventricles are derived from the primitive ventricle and bulbus cordis. So primitive ventricle, it forms the rough inflow part, which is the inflowing part of right and left ventricles, and bulbus cordis forms the smooth outflowing part of right and left ventricle. So the rough inflow part is here on inside, and the smooth outflow part so the smooth outflow part is from the bulbus cordis and rough inflow part is from the primitive ventricles. Now next about the primitive atrium. It is partitioned from the rough part to right and left atria. So it forms right and left atria. And the central part and the right horn of sinus venosus, it gets absorbed into the primitive atrium to form the smooth part of the right atrium. And the left horn of sinus venosus and forms a part of coronary sinus that opens into the smooth part of right atrium. Now we shall discuss about the development of pericardium of heart. Pericardium has three components: serous component, which contains again visceral pericardium and parietal pericardium, and fibrous component. So first the serous component. So the serous component is the visceral pericardium. It is derived from the splanchnopleuric mesoderm. So we can see the endothelial heart tube. And here is the pericardial cavity. And we can see how it gets invaginated into the pericardial cavity, deriving inner visceral layer and outer parietal layer. So the serous pericardium, which is further divides into visceral and parietal layer. So the visceral layer is derived from the splanchnopleuric mesoderm, which is otherwise called epicardium. So this is from splanchnopleuric mesoderm. Then the parietal pericardium is derived from the somatopleuric mesoderm. And fibrous pericardium, which is derived from the form an inner layer, that is the pleuropericardial membrane, that is derived from the inner layer of the pleuropericardial membrane, which forms a fibrous pericardium covering the pericardial sac. So this pericardial sac, it is further covered by the fibrous pericardium. So fibrous pericardium is derived from the pleuropericardial membrane. So let's talk about the position of the heart tube in relation with the pericardial cavity. So before the formation of the head fold, the endothelial heart tube lies in the floor of the pericardial cavity. So endothelial heart tube, we can see here, enlarged image, the purple one, this is the pericardial cavity. So the heart tube lies in the floor of the pericardial cavity caudal to the septum transversum. So you can see the septum transversum on the anterior aspect. After the formation of the head fold, the pericardial cavity and heart tube comes to lie ventral to the foregut and cranial to the septum transversum. So in the second image, you can see the head fold where the you can see the pericardial cavity is on the ventral side. And septum transversum lies caudal to the developing heart tube. So that is changes in the position of heart tube. Next, about the development of the wall of the heart, the mesoderm around the endocardium forms the myocardium. So the myocardial cells secrete some extracellular matrix which is rich in hyaluronic acid, which is called as cardiac jelly. And this cardiac jelly is gelatinous substance which is secreted by the cardiac myocytes and is present between the endothelium myocardium of the embryonic heart, and which transforms into a connective tissue of endocardium. The extracellular matrix of the heart, historically termed as the cardiac jelly, and acts as a site for the deposition of inductive factors from the myocardial cells, which in turn modify the differentiation of specific endocardial cells. It has been called as gelatinoreticulum, a myoepicardial reticulum, and more recently the myocardial basement membrane. So the cardiac jelly accumulates within the endocardial cushions, which are the precursors of cardiac valves, and mesoderm that migrates the coelomic wall near the liver into the cardiac region, forming the epicardium. Let's see about the acquisition of external adult form of heart. So the circulations, the primitive heart tube acquires the adult form as the development progresses. The circulated heart tube, particularly the bulbus cordis and the primitive ventricle, grows rapidly in a limited space. So we can see here, this is the bulbus cordis. And this is the venous and sinus venosus. And here is the pericardial cavity. and this is septum transversum. So as the development progressed, the circulated heart, particularly the bulbus cordis we can see, and primitive ventricle, it grows rapidly in a limited space. And since the arterial and venous ends of the heart tube are fixed, it gradually invaginates in the pericardial cavity in a U-shaped manner, which is called as the cardiac loop. So we can see the bulbus cordis and primitive ventricle growing enormously, and primitive ventricle growing enormously within the pericardial sac, forming a loop, which is the cardiac loop. So this cardiac loop mainly involves the bulbus cordis from the cephalic limb of the loop and the primitive ventricle forming the caudal limb of the loop. So the cephalic limb is the bulbus cordis and caudal limb is the primitive ventricle. So initially the bulboventricular loop is suspended in the dorsal wall of the pericardial sac by a mesentery called as dorsal mesocardium. So here we can see the mesentery. Which is called as dorsal mesocardium. But the central part of the mesentery soon degenerates, forming a communication with the right and left sides of the pericardial cavity. So you can see a communication. Because of the degeneration of the dorsal mesocardium in its central part. So that it leaves a communication between the right and left sides of the pericardial cavity. And this communication later in adults, it forms the transverse pericardial sinus. So this turns to form pericardial sinus. Then next about this bulboventricular loop, it lies freely in the pericardial cavity, but the primitive atrium and sinus venosus lie outside the pericardial cavity. So you can see it is plunged into the septum transversum, almost outside the pericardial cavity. So this is primitive atrium and sinus venosus. So which is embedded in the septum transversum. So this is purple one is the septum transversum. So as the primitive atrium and the sinus venosus get freed from the septum transversum, they enter the pericardial cavity and occupy the posterior-superior portion of the ventricle. So you can see they are involuting back into the pericardial cavity, occupying the posterior-superior part of the heart. So that is about the sinus venosus, that is a venous end. So the primitive atrium and the sinus venosus, once it is freed from the septum transversum, they enter into this pericardial cavity and occupy on the posterior-superior aspect of the ventricle. So these are the red ones represents the ventricles and the blue ones represents the atria, right and left atria. The heart, it becomes like almost S-like. See here. So it is H-shaped. Now the bulboventricular sulcus, which disappears, and bulbus cordis and primitive ventricle adheres to form a common chamber. So this bulboventricular, this one, it disappears. So the sulcus, which is between the bulbus cordis and primitive ventricle, it disappears, forming a common chamber. And the atrial chamber that lies above the truncus arteriosus expands, and as it does so, parts of it becomes project forwards on the either side of the truncus arteriosus as auricles. So these projections, atria on each side, they are present in adult as auricles. So that is how the heart develops. So here is in the beginning we can see the venous end of the heart. The venous end of the heart. This is the arterial end of the heart and heart tube. And this is after the formation of head fold. where the heart tube lies in the pericardial cavity on the ventral aspect of the embryo. Let's see some clinical aspects associated with the development of heart. Ectopia cordis, it is a rare condition in which the heart lies exposed on the surface of the thorax, and it occurs due to the non-union of two sternal plates of developing sternum. So death occurs in most of the cases during the first few days after birth. The next about the dextrocardia, it is also a rare condition in which the heart is points towards the right side of the chest instead of the left side. It occurs if the heart tube bends to the left instead of the right. So the heart is displaced to the right and there is a transposition. So the dextrocardia may be associated with situs inversus. Situs inversus, also called as situs transversus or situs oppositus. It is a congenital condition in which the major visceral organs are reversed or mirrored from their normal position. Means which are supposed to be on the left side, they will be on the right side. And the normal arrangement of internal organs is known as situs solitus. So with this, we are winding up this session that we could continue with the development of heart with the heart chambers.